There is a moment, quiet, invisible to the world, when something shifts inside an avoidant. It doesn't happen when you beg. It doesn't happen when you explain yourself for the 100th time. It doesn't happen when you shrink, chase, or prove your value. It happens when the illusion of safety they built through distance finally collapses. Because here's the truth. Avoidance is not strength. It's a strategy. A strategy born from pain, from past wounds, from a nervous system that learned long ago that closeness equals danger. For a long time, pulling away feels like control. Silence feels powerful. Independence feels safe. But control has a cost, and eventually, that cost becomes heavier than the fear. The exact moment an avoidant decides to fight for you is the moment they realize that running no longer brings peace. They sit in the silence they created, and instead of relief, they feel loss. Instead of freedom, they feel emptiness. Instead of power, they feel regret. That's when the soul wakes up. You see, human beings are wired for connection. You can suppress it, intellectualize it, outrun it, but you cannot delete it. And when you stop chasing, when you stop reacting, when you stop abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable, something profound happens. Your absence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, they finally see themselves. They feel the weight of what you brought into their life. Your presence, your consistency, your energy, your love. Not as pressure, not as obligation, but as truth. And truth has a way of shaking people awake. This is where divine order steps in. Because life has a law, what you don't appreciate, you eventually lose. And loss is a teacher like no other. When you choose self-respect over attachment, when you choose alignment over anxiety, you stop operating from fear, and that energy shifts everything. At that moment, the avoidant is faced with a decision they can no longer avoid. Continue running and repeat the same cycle of loneliness, or grow. And growth requires courage. Growth requires humility. Growth requires stepping into vulnerability without guarantees. Fighting for you doesn't mean dramatic gestures at first. It begins internally. It begins with awareness, with the realization, I can't keep living like this. It's the moment they understand that love isn't a trap, it's a responsibility. Not to you, but to themselves. And here's the most important truth. Listen closely. This moment is not about them choosing you. It's about you choosing yourself. Because when you embody your worth, you stop trying to be chosen. You become undeniable. When someone fights for you from that place, it's no longer fear-based attachment. It's conscious love. It's not driven by panic. It's driven by purpose. They don't come back because they're scared to lose you. They come back because they're ready to become someone who can keep you. And whether they rise to that level or not, you win. Because you are no longer waiting. You are no longer shrinking. You are no longer negotiating your value. The moment an avoidant decides to fight for you is the moment you stop fighting for them. And that's not abandonment. That's alignment. That's power. That's divine timing. Stand in your truth. Hold your boundaries. Trust the process, because love that is meant to stay will always rise to meet the standard you set. And if it doesn't, life will bring you something even greater. An avoidant decides to fight for you the moment emotional safety outweighs their fear of loss of control. And this is not a sudden emotional impulse, but a deep internal recalibration. For most avoidants, control has never been about dominance over another person. It has been about survival. Somewhere in their past, closeness became associated with pain, unpredictability, or emotional overwhelm. So they learned that distance equals safety. Independence equals protection. Keeping emotional doors half closed feels like power, because it prevents anyone from getting close enough to hurt them. But over time, that strategy begins to fail. Emotional safety is not something an avoidant recognizes easily. At first, it feels foreign, even suspicious. When someone offers consistency without pressure, love without demands, and presence without intrusion, it challenges the avoidant's nervous system. Their instinct is to pull back, to test, to create space, and see if they can breathe again. But when you respond not with panic, not with chasing, but with grounded self-respect, something shifts. The distance no longer brings relief. It brings confusion. The silence no longer feels calming. It feels empty. This is where emotional safety begins to outweigh control. Safety is not about guarantees or certainty. It's about regulation. It's about the quiet realization that being with you does not require them to perform, hide, or defend. They start to sense that they can exist as they are without being consumed or controlled. Ironically, this safety only becomes visible once you stop trying to manage their emotions for them. When you release the need to fix, convince, or hold the relationship together alone, you allow space for their nervous system to experience something new, choice. Fear of loss of control is deeply tied to fear of vulnerability. To an avoidant, opening up can feel like surrendering power. But there comes a moment when holding everything inside becomes more exhausting than the risk of being seen. The inner tension of constant self-protection begins to outweigh the perceived danger of connection. They notice that their walls are no longer keeping pain out, they're keeping meaning out. Control starts to feel like isolation rather than strength. At this stage, emotional safety becomes associated with you not because you tried to prove anything, but because you embodied stability. You didn't collapse when they pulled away. You didn't abandon yourself to keep them close. That consistency sends a powerful message to the avoidance subconscious. Connection does not equal chaos. Love does not equal loss of self. In that realization, control loses its grip. When emotional safety surpasses fear, the avoidant begins to see that fighting for the relationship is not about losing autonomy but reclaiming wholeness. They understand, often for the first time, that true safety does not come from distance but from the courage to stay present. And in that internal shift, the desire to fight for you is no longer driven by fear of abandonment, but by the realization that letting you go would mean returning to a life ruled by emotional isolation. Distance becomes painful for an avoidant when it no longer serves its original purpose, and this is one of the most misunderstood turning points in their inner world. At first, distance feels like relief. It gives them room to breathe, space to think, and the illusion that they are safe from emotional demands. Pulling away reduces anxiety in the short term, so the mind labels it as the correct solution. But avoidance is a temporary anesthetic, not a cure. Over time, what once soothed the nervous system begins to create a deeper ache. An avoidant relies on distance to regulate emotions they never learned how to process in connection. When closeness triggers vulnerability, the instinct is to withdraw. Yet when you stop chasing, stop pushing, and stop trying to pull them back into closeness, the dynamic changes. The distance is no longer a reaction to pressure. It becomes a self-created state. And in that stillness, the avoidant can no longer blame anyone else for the emptiness they feel. This is where pain enters. Not dramatic pain, not panic, but a quiet, persistent sense of lack. They notice the absence of emotional warmth, shared moments, and the grounding presence you once provided. The very space they believed would protect them now amplifies what is missing. Silence stretches longer. Days feel flatter. Achievements feel less satisfying. The distance stops feeling empowering and starts feeling hollow. What makes this especially transformative is that the pain does not come from you doing something wrong. It comes from you doing nothing at all. Your calm absence forces introspection. Without conflict to distract them and without reassurance to numb them, the avoidant must face the consequences of disconnection. They begin to realize that distance is not neutral. It has a cost. And that cost is emotional numbness, loneliness, and a growing sense that something meaningful is slipping away. At this stage, the avoidant's identity as someone who doesn't need much begins to crack. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. The mind that once justified withdrawal now struggles to explain why separation hurts. This creates cognitive dissonance. If distance is supposed to keep me safe, why do I feel worse, not better? That question is powerful because it challenges the core belief system that has governed their relationships. For years, pain becomes the teacher. It gently but persistently exposes the limits of avoidance. The avoidant starts to sense that the pain of staying distant may soon outweigh the fear of closeness. And this is crucial, because human behavior changes not when we understand something intellectually, but when the emotional cost of staying the same becomes too high. When distance no longer protects them from vulnerability, it forces a reckoning. They see that withdrawal does not eliminate attachment, it only delays its impact. The longing they tried to suppress resurfaces, not as desperation, but as awareness. And in that awareness, the avoidant begins to understand that the space they created is not a shield. It's a barrier to the very connection they secretly crave. Your self-worth and boundaries are the true catalyst for an avoidance awakening, not your pursuit. Explanations are emotional labor. An avoidant is not moved by intensity, they are moved by stability. When you chase, overgive, or continually try to prove your value, it unconsciously reinforces their belief that closeness is overwhelming and that they hold the power in dynamic. Your anxiety becomes familiar to them, even comfortable, because it allows them to remain emotionally distant while still receiving connection on their terms. The shift happens when you stop trying to be chosen and start choosing yourself. This is not an act of punishment or manipulation. It is an act of alignment. When you set boundaries and honor them without anger, drama, or threats, you introduce a new energetic language into the relationship. The avoidant is no longer dealing with someone who is available at any cost. They are now facing someone who values themselves enough to walk away from what does not meet their emotional needs. Boundaries create contrast, and contrast creates clarity. When you no longer chase, the avoidant loses the familiar feedback loop that kept them emotionally comfortable. Your silence is not loud, it is grounded. And that grounded presence is deeply unsettling to someone who is used to control through distance. They begin to feel the shift in power, not because you took it from them, but because you stopped giving it away. Self-worth communicates something words never can. It says, I know what I bring, and I will not negotiate my value. For an avoidant, this challenges a core subconscious belief that people will always stay no matter how little they offer emotionally. When that belief is disrupted, awareness begins. They start to reflect, often for the first time, on their role in the dynamic, not out of guilt, but out of realization. Boundaries also provide emotional safety, paradoxically. When you stop over-functioning in the relationship, the emotional pressure decreases. The avoidant no longer feels responsible for managing your feelings, fixing your pain, or carrying the weight of your expectations. In that space, they can finally feel rather than react. Your grounded self-respect creates an environment where connection feels possible instead of threatening. This is why pleading never works, but dignity does. When you remain kind yet firm, open yet unavailable to mistreatment, the avoidant is forced to reconcile two truths. They are losing access to someone meaningful, and that loss is a direct consequence of their emotional withdrawal. There is no argument to fight against, no drama to escape from, only reality. At this point, the avoidant faces a choice: stay in old patterns and accept the loss, or grow into someone capable of meeting you at your level. Your boundaries do not demand change, they invite it. And if the avoidant chooses to fight for you, it is not because you convinced them, but because your self-worth showed them what is possible. When love is rooted in mutual respect rather than fear, growth in silence is one of the most uncomfortable experiences for an avoidant because it removes every external distraction they once relied on to escape themselves. When communication stops, when explanations end, and when emotional engagement is no longer available on demand, the avoidant is left alone with their internal world. This is not the same as freedom. It is confrontation. Silence becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, they begin to see patterns they have spent a lifetime avoiding. During connection, the avoidant can deflect responsibility by focusing on the other person's needs, reactions, or emotions. They can tell themselves that the problem was pressure, expectations, or timing, but in silence, there is no one to project onto. There is no immediate reassurance to numb the discomfort. The nervous system, once soothed by withdrawal, starts to feel restless. Old defenses no longer work because there is nothing to push against. This is where real growth begins. Not because they want it, but because they can no longer outrun it. The absence you create is not empty, it is structured. It forces reflection. Memories resurface. Moments of connection replay. The avoidance starts to recognize the consistency you offered, the patience you showed, and the emotional safety you embodied. And with that recognition comes an uncomfortable awareness they did not lose you because love failed, but because fear was never challenged. Silence strips away fantasy. Without ongoing interaction, the avoidant cannot maintain the illusion that you will always be there. Time passes. Life continues. And they sense, sometimes for the first time, that your absence may be permanent. This awareness shifts their internal dialogue from avoidance to evaluation. They begin asking questions they once suppressed. Why do I always pull away when things become real? Why do I feel this loss so deeply if distance is supposed to protect me? What makes growth in silence so powerful is that it is self-directed. No one is forcing insight upon them. No one is asking for accountability. The realizations emerge organically, which makes them harder to deny. Growth that is chosen, even reluctantly, has far more impact than growth demanded. As this process unfolds, the avoidant starts to feel the weight of what is at stake. The connection they minimize now feels irreplaceable. The person they assumed would adapt forever is no longer available. This is not panic, it is clarity. They understand that continuing on the same path will lead to the same outcome: loss, disconnection. 8. ND. Emotional isolation. Silence also removes emotional dependency. When you are no longer present to regulate the dynamic, the avoidant must learn to regulate themselves. This is deeply uncomfortable, but it is also empowering. It introduces the possibility of change. They begin to see that fighting for you would require growth, vulnerability, and accountability, but also that not fighting would mean repeating the same lonely cycle. In this quiet reckoning, the avoidant realizes that the door you closed was not slammed in anger, it was closed with self-respect. And that realization lingers. It plants a seed. Whether or not they act immediately, something irreversible has happened. They can no longer unsee the truth revealed in the silence, and that truth becomes the foundation for any genuine effort to fight for the connection they once took for granted. Love becomes a conscious choice for an avoidant when fear can no longer justify running away. And this shift represents one of the most profound internal transformations they can experience. For much of their life, avoidance has been automatic. It is a reflex, not a decision. When emotions rise, they pull back. When intimacy deepens, they create distance. Fear operates beneath awareness, quietly dictating behavior while the mind constructs logical reasons to leave, detach, or disengage. In this state, love is not chosen, it is managed, limited, and controlled. The turning point arrives when fear stops delivering the protection it once promised. The avoidant begins to notice that every escape leads to the same destination: temporary relief followed by emotional emptiness. Running no longer feels intelligent, it feels repetitive. Patterns become visible, relationships blur together, different faces, same ending, and in that recognition, the avoidant starts to question the authority fear has held over their life. Conscious choice requires awareness, and awareness is born from contrast. When you step out of the cycle, when you stop pursuing, stop arguing, and stop emotionally over-investing, the avoidant is forced to experience the full consequence of their avoidance. There is no one left to trigger, no one left to blame, just the echo of their own decisions. And in that echo, they discover something unsettling. Fear has cost them something real. At this stage, the avoidant understands that love is not the threat they believed it to be. The real threat is emotional stagnation. Staying the same means repeating loss. Growing means risking discomfort, vulnerability, and uncertainty, but also access to depth, connection, and meaning. This is where love becomes intentional. Not a reaction, not a feeling that comes and goes, but a value-based decision. Choosing love does not mean fear disappears. Fear is still present, but it no longer sits in the driver's seat. The avoidant begins to realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. They see that running away has never prevented pain, it has only postponed it. And postponement as a price. This conscious choice is also tied to identity. The avoidant starts to ask, often quietly, who do I want to be? Not in theory, but in practice. Do they want to remain someone who retreats at the first sign of vulnerability, or become someone who can stay, communicate, and repair? Fighting for love becomes less about he relationship and more about self-respect. It is a declaration that they no longer want fear to define their capacity for connection. When an avoidant reaches this stage, their actions change, not perfectly, not instantly, but intentionally. They show up differently. They take responsibility. They lean in when instinct tells them to pull away. Love becomes an act of presence rather than an emotional gamble. And in this shift, love transforms from something they fear losing into something they are willing to stand for. Thank you for giving your time, your presence, and your heart to this message. May it serve you with clarity, strength, and peace. Until we meet again, honor your worth, trust the journey, and walk forward knowing the right love will always rise to meet you.